Most people think the most dangerous stories begin with noise. Sirens, panic, a moment where everything clearly goes wrong. This one didn't. This story began quietly, inside a home that looked ordinary enough to be trusted, in a neighborhood where routines were respected and questions felt unnecessary. When one man vanished, there was no urgency, no fear, no reason to believe anything was wrong at all. In fact, what made this case so disturbing wasn't what investigators eventually uncovered. It was how long everyone accepted a version of reality that felt calm, reasonable, and complete. Because this wasn't a crime built on rage or chaos. It was built on certainty, on a story told so confidently that no one thought to challenge it. And by the time detectives finally did, they realized something chilling. The truth hadn't been hidden somewhere far away. It had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, protected not by darkness but by normalcy, by trust, by the assumption that nothing this disturbing could exist inside a life that looked so controlled. And that's what makes this case different. Not what happened, but how easily it blended into everyday life. On a quiet suburban street where nothing ever made the evening news, where lawns were trimmed like they were competing for trophies and porch lights flicked on at the same time every night, no one suspected they were living next door to a story so dark it would eventually shake the country, because the scariest true crime stories never begin with screams or sirens. They begin with normal, with routine, with smiles that don't linger too long and neighbors who wave but never ask questions. And if you'd driven past the pale blue house on Brookside Lane in the early 2000s, you would have seen what looked like a picture-perfect American family. 2 kids riding bikes in the driveway, a father who left for work every morning at the same time, and a mother who volunteered at school events and baked casseroles for church potlucks. And that's exactly why no one noticed the warning signs until it was already too late. Friends described Daniel Carter as dependable, quiet, and predictable, the kind of man who paid bills early and believed problems could always be fixed with enough effort, while his wife Melissa Carter came across as warm, soft-spoken, and deeply devoted to her family. Someone who talked endlessly about doing what was best for her children, a phrase she repeated so often that people barely noticed how tightly she clung to it. How it wasn't just a belief but a justification. Because long before anyone knew Daniel was missing, long before police stepped into that house, something inside that marriage had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Behind closed doors, the marriage was unraveling in silence, not with explosive fights but with cold withdrawal, resentment that hardened over years, and a growing belief inside Melissa's mind that she was trapped in a life she didn't choose anymore. And people who later studied the case would say this wasn't a crime of passion but of rationalization, because Melissa didn't see herself as a monster. She saw herself as someone making difficult choices, and that belief would become the most dangerous thing of all. Because when a person convinces themselves they're doing the right thing, there's almost nothing they won't justify. Daniel's last confirmed sighting was on a Thursday morning, a routine day that ended with him never clocking in at work, and at first no one panicked because adults disappear briefly all the time, phones die, schedules change. But when one day turned into 2 and then 3, co-workers began asking questions, family members started calling, and eventually police knocked on Melissa's door, where she greeted them calmly. Her voice steady as she explained that her husband had gone away to clear his head. And it was such a reasonable explanation that officers noted it and moved on, unaware that they had just accepted the first layer of a lie that would take years to fully peel back. What investigators didn't know then, but would later uncover piece by piece, was that the house itself had already begun to tell a story. Subtle at first, almost invisible, changes in routine, trash taken out at odd hours, groceries purchased that didn't align with usual family habits, and neighbors who noticed strange smells but dismissed them as cooking experiments or plumbing issues. Because when evil hides inside domestic normalcy, it doesn't announce itself, it blends in. And Melissa was exceptionally good at blending in. As weeks passed, Melissa leaned into the role of the worried wife just enough to avoid suspicion, attending school events, answering questions politely, and repeating the same carefully crafted narrative about a husband who needed space. And what made it convincing wasn't just her performance, but the fact that she truly believed it. Because in her mind, Daniel wasn't gone. He was simply removed from the equation, and that distinction between absence and erasure would become crucial when investigators finally started to see the cracks. The first real shift came when Daniel's bank account showed no activity, no withdrawals, no travel expenses, nothing that matched Melissa's story, and detectives began to wonder how a man could vanish without leaving a financial footprint. But even then, no one was prepared for where that question would lead, because the truth of what happened inside that home wasn't just about murder. It was about control, deception, and a line crossed so completely that once the evidence surfaced, even seasoned investigators struggled to process it. And the most haunting part wasn't the act itself, but how long it took for anyone to realize that the danger had never left the house, that it had stayed behind, hidden in routines, in meals shared at the table, in the quiet assumption that children are always safest at home. Because as this case would eventually prove, sometimes the greatest threat isn't the stranger outside, it's the story no one wants to imagine happening inside their own neighborhood. And this was only the beginning. By the time detectives formally reclassified Daniel Carter's disappearance from a missing person case to a suspicious absence, nearly 6 weeks had passed. And in true crime, time is either your greatest enemy or your loudest witness. Because while people forget details and alibis blur, patterns never lie, and the pattern surrounding Daniel's life had frozen in place as if someone had pressed pause on it. No credit card swipes, no social media activity, no phone pings lighting up distant cell towers, just silence. And silence, investigators know, is rarely accidental, especially when it arrives without warning and stays that way. And when they began retracing Daniel's last known movements, everything pointed back to one place, one constant, one person, his home and his wife. Melissa welcomed detectives back into the house with the same calm composure she'd shown the first time, offering coffee, answering questions with rehearsed patience, and repeating her explanation without deviation, which in itself became suspicious because genuine memories tend to wobble under pressure, while manufactured stories stay rigid, and detectives noticed how Melissa's version of events lacked the small human details that usually accompany truth. No irritation, no frustration, no emotional residue, just a clean narrative that felt more like a press statement than a recollection. And as they sat across from her, officers began noticing the subtle disconnect between her words and her reactions. The way she spoke about Daniel in the past tense without realizing it. The way she corrected herself too quickly, as if she'd practiced catching those slips before. Inside the home, investigators observed changes that didn't match a grieving spouse's behavior. Daniel's personal items were missing or oddly reorganized, his clothes donated, his tools gone, his side of the closet conspicuously empty, and when asked about it, Melissa explained that she was moving on, a phrase that landed wrong considering the official narrative was still that her husband might return. And this premature erasure raised red flags because psychologically, people who believe someone is coming back tend to preserve their space, while people who know someone isn't tend to clean it away, and that distinction would later become one of the most telling indicators of guilt. As the investigation deepened, detectives pulled Melissa's phone records and discovered frequent late-night searches that, taken alone, might have seemed innocent, but when viewed together painted a chilling picture of preparation rather than panic. Searches about decomposition timelines, household cleaning methods, and legal consequences of spousal disappearance, all spaced out over weeks, suggesting not a single impulsive moment but a sustained mental process, a slow building of resolve, and forensic psychologists would later explain that this pattern aligns with offenders who don't snap but instead convince themselves step by step that what they're planning is necessary, justified, even logical. Neighbors were interviewed next, and their statements began to contradict Melissa's carefully maintained image. Several recalled unusual activity during the time Daniel vanished. Garbage being taken out repeatedly late at night, strong cooking smells lingering far longer than usual, windows opened in cold weather, and Melissa appearing unusually upbeat in the days following her husband's disappearance, hosting dinners, chatting casually, behaving less like someone in limbo and more like someone who felt relieved. And while none of this was proof, it formed a mosaic of behavioral anomalies that investigators could no longer ignore. The children's teachers added another disturbing layer without realizing it at the time, reporting that the kids' routines had changed abruptly, lunch habits shifting, unusual anxiety appearing in subtle ways. And when counselors attempted gentle conversations, the children struggled to articulate their feelings, offering vague answers that suggested confusion rather than awareness, and detectives made a careful decision here, limiting exposure, involving child specialists, and documenting everything with precision. Because cases involving families demand restraint as much as urgency, and one misstep could permanently damage lives already caught in something they didn't understand. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic confession or a surprise witness, but from a routine forensic sweep of the house. When investigators focused on areas that had been aggressively cleaned, surfaces scrubbed past necessity, and drains that showed chemical residue inconsistent with normal household use. And while nothing overt was visible, experienced investigators know that overcleaning is often louder than neglect, because people erase what they fear will speak, and lab results began returning with microscopic traces that suggested the home had been the primary scene of a violent event, contradicting Melissa's claim that Daniel had simply left. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Melissa didn't break down, didn't lash out, didn't cry. She doubled down, repeating her story with even more confidence, which again alarmed investigators because innocent people usually grow frustrated when disbelieved, while guilty ones focus on maintaining control. And psychologists observing the interview later noted classic signs of compartmentalization. Melissa had mentally separated the act from its consequences, viewing the investigation as an inconvenience rather than a moral reckoning, and that detachment allowed her to remain calm even as the walls closed in. Behind the scenes, prosecutors began assembling a case built not on shock but on structure, because they knew that whatever had happened inside that house would be difficult for a jury to emotionally process, and emotional overload can backfire. So they focused instead on timelines, digital footprints, behavioral changes, and contradictions that left no room for alternative explanations. And when a search warrant was finally executed for areas beyond the house, including disposal sites linked through trash collection records, the investigation crossed from suspicion into something far darker, something that forced even hardened professionals to step back and reassess what they thought they understood about domestic crime. Investigators were no longer asking if Daniel Carter was dead. They were asking how long Melissa had been planning it, how deeply she believed her own justifications, and most disturbingly, how much of her carefully constructed family narrative had been built on deception long before the crime itself. Because the evidence wasn't just pointing toward a murder, it was pointing toward a mindset where morality had been quietly rewritten, where ordinary actions took on sinister meanings, and where the home that was supposed to protect had instead become the center of a calculated disappearance. And as detectives prepared to make their move, unaware of how shocking the full truth would be once exposed, one question haunted everyone involved. If Melissa was willing to go this far to erase her husband, what else had she convinced herself was acceptable along the way? By the time detectives brought Melissa Carter in for what would become the longest interview of the case, the investigation had quietly crossed a point of no return. Because this was no longer about proving Daniel was gone. It was about forcing a carefully constructed reality to collide with facts that could no longer be controlled. And Melissa sensed it the moment she walked into the interrogation room. Not because anyone raised their voice or accused her outright, but because the tone had changed, the casual politeness replaced with deliberate pauses, the kind of silence investigators use not to intimidate, but to let a person hear their own thoughts echo back at them. And for the first time since Daniel vanished, Melissa wasn't steering the conversation. Detectives began not with the night Daniel disappeared, but with Melissa herself, her childhood, her marriage, her sense of identity, and this was intentional. Because people who commit deeply rationalized crimes often reveal more when talking about who they believe they are rather than what they've done. And as Melissa spoke, a pattern emerged that experts would later describe as a hero-victim narrative, a worldview where she saw herself as the central stabilizing force in the family, the only one capable of making hard decisions, the only one strong enough to endure emotional suffering for the sake of others. And when investigators gently introduced contradictions, financial records, digital searches, witness accounts, Melissa didn't deny them outright. She reframed them, explaining each inconsistency as misunderstood necessity, another small sacrifice she'd made to keep things together. This reframing was the crack where the truth began to seep through because rather than defending Daniel's absence as temporary, Melissa began speaking about it as inevitable, suggesting that his presence had been harmful, destabilizing, and emotionally damaging. Claims that didn't align with any prior reports but revealed something far more important, a psychological shift where Daniel was no longer a person in her mind, but a problem that had required a solution. And when investigators asked directly whether she believed her family was better off without him, Melissa hesitated just long enough for the room to feel it, and that hesitation told them more than any confession could have. The interview stretched on for hours, and as fatigue set in, Melissa's emotional regulation began to slip, not into panic or remorse, but into irritation. Especially when investigators challenged her logic. And this irritation marked a turning point because it revealed a core trait seen in certain offenders. A belief that others simply don't understand the necessity of their actions. That resistance isn't moral opposition but ignorance. And when detectives presented forensic findings that placed a violent event inside the home, Melissa's response wasn't shock, it was resignation. A subtle lowering of her shoulders, a quiet acknowledgement that the narrative was finally slipping beyond her control. What followed wasn't a cinematic breakdown, but a gradual unraveling. Statements that contradicted earlier versions, timelines that shifted mid-sentence, and language that grew increasingly detached, referring to events as processes rather than actions, outcomes rather than choices. And forensic psychologists later noted that this linguistic distancing is common in individuals who have mentally separated themselves from the moral weight of what they've done, because acknowledging agency would shatter the justification they've built their identity around. Outside the interrogation room, prosecutors reviewed the evidence with mounting gravity, aware that the details of the case, once fully understood, would be difficult for a jury to absorb without emotional overload, and so they made a strategic decision to focus not on sensationalism, but on intention, building a narrative that showed premeditation, planning, and sustained deception because intent is what transforms a disturbing case into an undeniable one. And the more they examined Melissa's digital history, the clearer it became that this was not a single moment gone wrong, but a sequence of deliberate steps, each one reinforcing the next, until turning back no longer felt possible to her. Perhaps the most unsettling development came from expert analysis of Melissa's behavior after Daniel's disappearance, particularly her interactions with her children. which investigators approached with extreme care, involving specialists trained to observe without planting ideas, and what emerged was not evidence of awareness but of manipulation through omission. A controlled environment where questions were deflected, routines altered, and reality subtly reshaped to avoid confrontation. And experts emphasized this distinction repeatedly because the children were not participants or accomplices, but dependents living inside a narrative crafted entirely by an adult who believed control equaled protection. As the case moved toward arrest, law enforcement prepared for the public reaction, knowing that once details emerged, the shock wouldn't just be about what happened to Daniel, but about who Melissa had presented herself as, because society struggles most with crimes that contradict our assumptions about safety, motherhood, and domestic normalcy. And this case threatened all three. And when Melissa was finally taken into custody, she didn't resist, didn't cry, didn't ask about Daniel. She asked about her children, not with fear, but with certainty, as if confident that everything she'd done would eventually be understood. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, neighbors replaying every interaction, every smile, every shared meal, wondering how something so extreme could hide in plain sight, and media coverage exploded, not because the case was new, but because the implications were impossible to ignore. Headlines framing the story as a mystery turning into a nightmare, commentators debating motive, mental health, and morality, while experts cautioned against simplistic explanations, reminding the public that the most dangerous crimes are often committed not by people who look broken, but by people who believe they are right. And as Melissa awaited trial, prosecutors prepared to reveal the full scope of the deception, aware that the next phase of this story, the courtroom, the testimony, the psychological dissection, would force everyone watching to confront an uncomfortable truth: that evil doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it arrives calmly, politely, wrapped in logic, and by the time it's recognized, the damage has already been done. By the time Melissa Carter entered the courtroom for the first day of trial, the case had already taken on a life of its own. Not just as a murder investigation, but as a cultural shockwave. Because America has seen countless true crime stories, but the ones that stay buried in the public psyche are the ones that force people to question their most basic assumptions about family, trust, and safety. And this case did exactly that. Because Melissa didn't look like a villain, she didn't act like one. And even sitting at the defense table, she appeared composed, almost serene, as if she were attending a school meeting rather than facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life behind bars. The prosecution knew from the beginning that this would not be a case won through theatrics because the facts themselves were heavy enough, and instead they constructed a methodical narrative designed to dismantle Melissa's story piece by piece, showing the jury not just what happened, but how her version of reality slowly collapsed under its own contradictions. And they opened with a simple statement that would echo throughout the trial. Daniel Carter did not disappear, he was removed, and every action Melissa took afterward was designed to maintain that removal. Not just physically, but psychologically, socially, and legally. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding a layer that chipped away at the image Melissa had tried so hard to preserve. Co-workers described Daniel's stability and future plans, directly contradicting claims that he was emotionally unstable or planning to leave. Neighbors recounted strange late-night activity and behavior that now carried a darker weight in hindsight. And digital forensic experts walked the jury through Melissa's online searches, calendar entries, and deleted messages, explaining how these weren't the panicked actions of a spouse in crisis, but the calculated steps of someone planning for permanence. And as this evidence stacked up, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from curiosity to quiet disbelief. The most powerful moments came not from graphic descriptions, which the court deliberately avoided, but from expert testimony explaining behavior, because understanding why someone commits a crime is often more disturbing than knowing how. And psychologists testified about rationalization, about moral disengagement, about how certain individuals convince themselves that harmful actions are not only acceptable but necessary. And they explained that Melissa's calm demeanor was not evidence of innocence or insanity, but of internal consistency, a mind that had already resolved the conflict long before the law ever caught up to it. When the defense presented its case, it leaned heavily on emotional framing, attempting to portray Melissa as overwhelmed, isolated, and pushed beyond her limits, suggesting that stress, marital conflict, and fear had clouded her judgment. But this argument struggled to gain traction against the prosecution's timeline, because stress explains impulsive mistakes, not sustained deception. And jurors could see that Melissa hadn't unraveled after Daniel's disappearance. She had organized, planned, and adapted behaviors that pointed not to loss of control, but to deliberate control exercised over time. Perhaps the most unsettling day of the trial came when the court addressed the impact on the children, and the judge set strict boundaries on what could be discussed, ensuring the focus remained on adult responsibility rather than sensationalism. And experts testified not about acts but about environment, about how children can exist inside a carefully managed reality without understanding its origins, and how silence, omission, and redirection can be just as powerful as lies. And this testimony reframed the narrative completely, shifting the lens away from horror and toward accountability, making it clear that the children were not evidence of guilt, but victims of circumstance shaped by an adult's decisions. Melissa took the stand in her own defense, a move that surprised many observers but made sense to those who had studied her psychology, because she believed in her ability to explain herself, to be understood if only people listened long enough. And for a while her testimony was compelling, articulate, emotionally controlled, and carefully worded, but under cross-examination, the same pattern emerged that investigators had seen months earlier. Explanations turned into justifications, justifications turned into entitlement. And when asked directly whether she believed she had done the right thing, Melissa hesitated again. That same pause, longer this time, heavier. And instead of denying it, she answered in a way that sealed her fate, not with remorse but with certainty. A certainty that the jury would later describe as chilling. Closing arguments brought the entire case into focus, the prosecution reminding jurors that understanding motive does not equal excusing action, that rationalization does not erase responsibility, and that calm cruelty is still cruelty, while the defense urged mercy, framing the case as a tragedy born of pressure rather than intent. And as the jury was sent to deliberate, the courtroom emptied into a silence that felt heavier than any outburst could have been, because everyone understood that the verdict would not just determine Melissa's future, but define how this story would be remembered. After days of deliberation, the jury returned, and in a moment that would be replayed across news networks, the four persons stood and delivered a verdict that reflected both the weight of the evidence and the moral clarity of the case, finding Melissa Carter guilty, not just of murder but of sustained deception. And as the sentence was read, Melissa showed little reaction, no visible breakdown, no visible relief, just a quiet stillness that confirmed what many had already suspected, that she had accepted this outcome long before the trial ever began. In the aftermath, the case sparked nationwide debate about how we define danger, about whether warning signs are always there or only visible in retrospect, and about how easily normalcy can be weaponized by someone determined to control a narrative. And experts would later say that the most terrifying aspect of the Carter case wasn't the crime itself, but how long it took for anyone to imagine it was possible. Because the truth is, monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like neighbors. Sometimes they cook dinner, sometimes they smile at school events, and sometimes by the time the mask comes off, the damage is already irreversible. Sentencing day arrived without spectacle, and in many ways that made it more unsettling. Because after months of headlines, expert testimony, and public outrage, The final chapter of Melissa Carter's legal fate unfolded in a courtroom stripped of drama, where the judge spoke not to shock, but to clarify, emphasizing that this case was not about sympathy or outrage, but about responsibility sustained over time. And as the sentence was handed down, decades behind bars with no early release, Melissa listened quietly, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as though the outcome merely confirmed a conclusion she had already reached internally. And observers would later say that this calm acceptance was the final proof that she had lived with her decision long before the law ever caught up to her. In his remarks, the judge addressed the core issue that had haunted the trial from the beginning: the idea that intention wrapped in justification can be more dangerous than rage, because rage burns out, but justification endures. And he spoke carefully about the harm caused not only by the act itself, but by the extended deception that followed, the deliberate reshaping of reality, the manipulation of routines, and the sustained effort to erase a person's existence. And with that, the legal system closed its chapter, leaving behind a silence that felt incomplete, because courtrooms can assign guilt and punishment, but they cannot resolve the deeper questions that cases like this leave behind. The children were placed under the care of relatives far from the neighborhood where everything had unfolded, and professionals emphasized the importance of stability, distance, and age-appropriate truth, making it clear that healing would not come from revelations but from consistency. And experts repeatedly stressed that the long-term impact would depend not on what the children eventually learned, but on how safely and gradually they were allowed to process it, because trauma is not defined only by events, but by how those events are framed and supported over time. And in this case, the priority was not understanding the crime, but reclaiming a sense of normalcy that had been quietly stolen. In the years that followed, psychologists, criminologists, and journalists continued to dissect the case, not because of its shock value, but because it challenged comfortable narratives about domestic danger. And studies referencing the Carter case focused on how ordinary environments can be used to conceal extraordinary harm, how social trust becomes camouflage, and how the language of protection can be twisted into a moral shield for acts that are anything but protective. And one recurring theme emerged again and again: that the most reliable warning signs are rarely dramatic. They are subtle shifts in behavior, control, and narrative consistency that only become obvious in hindsight. Melissa herself became something of a paradox within the prison system. Described as compliant, organized, and emotionally reserved, never denying her actions outright but framing them in language that continued to emphasize necessity over remorse. And forensic evaluators noted that while she understood the legal consequences, she remained emotionally anchored to her original justifications, a state they described as cognitive closure, where a person's internal story is so fixed that even punishment does not reopen moral questioning. And this insight became a cornerstone in discussions about prevention, because it underscored the reality that some crimes are not the result of emotional collapse but of emotional certainty. Public interest in the case eventually faded, as it always does, replaced by newer stories, newer shocks, newer headlines. But for those who studied it closely, the Carter case left behind a lingering unease because it didn't offer a clear villain archetype or a simple lesson. It offered something far more disturbing: the realization that danger can coexist with routine, that control can masquerade as care, and that people can commit irreversible harm not in moments of chaos but in moments of quiet decision-making, convinced they are doing what must be done. And that is why this story still matters, not because of its extremity, but because of its familiarity, because nothing about the setting felt extraordinary until it was, because the warning signs were not sirens but whispers, because the crime did not erupt, it unfolded step by step inside a space most people associate with safety. And as true crime experts often say, the purpose of telling stories like this is not to sensationalize, but to illuminate. to remind us that accountability does not begin in courtrooms. It begins in awareness, in listening closely when narratives feel too controlled, too clean, too complete. In the end, the most haunting question left by this case is not how it happened, but how long it went unquestioned, how easily certainty replaced doubt, and how many people looking back realized they had accepted a version of reality simply because it was presented calmly and confidently. Because the scariest crimes are not the ones that announce themselves loudly, but the ones that slip quietly into ordinary life, settle in, and wait until it's too late to ignore them. And that is where this story truly ends, not with a verdict or a sentence, but with a warning that still echoes long after the courtroom doors have closed. That normal is not the same as safe, that certainty is not the same as truth, and that sometimes the most important questions are the ones no one thinks to ask until the answers are already irreversible. Years after the verdict, long after the news vans disappeared and the neighborhood returned to quiet, the Carter case continued to surface in unexpected places, not in headlines, but in classrooms where criminology students debated moral disengagement, in police training seminars where detectives discussed missed signals, and in private conversations where people admitted, often in lowered voices, that this story bothered them more than most, not because of what was proven in court, but because of what could never be fully measured, and that lingering discomfort centered on a single realization. Nothing about this case announced itself as dangerous until it was already irreversible. Investigators who worked the case would later admit that the evidence made sense only in retrospect, that every warning sign, controlled narratives, premature erasure, emotional certainty was individually explainable, socially acceptable, even relatable. And it was only when viewed together that they formed a shape too dark to ignore. And that realization forced an uncomfortable reckoning, because if this case could unfold inside a life that looked so ordinary, then certainty itself became suspect. One detective, speaking years later under condition of anonymity, said the part that still kept him awake wasn't the crime or even the deception, it was how convincingly normal everything felt right up until the end. How easily everyone, including professionals, accepted calm as proof of harmlessness, and that observation echoed through expert analyses that followed, because calm, they argued, is one of the most misunderstood human signals, often mistaken for stability when in some cases it's simply resolution, a decision already made and emotionally settled long before anyone else knows there's a choice being weighed. This reframing changed how many investigators approached domestic cases afterward, shifting focus away from visible distress and toward narrative rigidity, because people in crisis fluctuate, while people who have crossed an internal line often don't. Psychologists continued to study Melissa's interviews and trial testimony, not to sensationalize her, but to understand how someone constructs a moral framework capable of sustaining extreme actions without emotional collapse. And what emerged was a portrait not of chaos, but of closure, a mind that had sealed itself against doubt, replacing uncertainty with certainty so absolute that outside perspectives became irrelevant. And experts warned that this kind of psychological finality is among the most dangerous states a person can reach, because it eliminates the internal brakes that normally prevent harm. And when questioned about remorse years later, Melissa's answers reportedly remained consistent, carefully worded, focused on outcome rather than ethics, reinforcing the conclusion that punishment alone does not undo justification once it has fully crystallized. For the children, whose lives were reshaped by forces they could not name at the time, the future became intentionally quiet, protected from public curiosity and speculation, because professionals understood that their healing depended not on revisiting the past, but on building a present that was predictable and safe. And while the public often demands answers, closure, and explanations, the reality is that some truths do not heal when exposed. They heal when handled with care, and in this case, restraint was the most humane response available, even if it left outsiders with unanswered questions. As true crime audiences revisited the case through documentaries and discussions, a subtle shift occurred in how it was framed, moving away from shock toward reflection, away from asking, "How could she do this?" and toward asking, "How did everyone miss it?" And that shift mattered because it redirected attention from spectacle to awareness, from villainization to vigilance, and experts emphasized again and again that the value of studying cases like this is not in identifying monsters but in recognizing moments where control masquerades as care, where certainty replaces dialogue, and where silence becomes a tool rather than a symptom. And so the story ends not with a revelation, but with a mirror held up to anyone willing to look into it, asking uncomfortable questions without offering easy answers. How often do we equate calm with safety, confidence with truth, routine with innocence? How often do we accept tidy explanations because they relieve us of the burden of doubt? And how many warning signs go unnoticed not because they are invisible, but because imagining their meaning feels too disturbing to consider? The Carter case does not linger because of what it proved in court. It lingers because of what it exposed about human perception, about how easily narratives can replace reality, and about how the most dangerous decisions are sometimes made not in moments of rage, but in moments of quiet certainty. That is why this story never truly ends, because its final chapter isn't written in verdicts or sentences, but in awareness, in the slow recognition that normalcy is not a guarantee of safety, that justification can be more destructive than anger, and that the most important safeguard against irreversible harm is not fear, but the willingness to question certainty before it hardens into something that cannot be undone. Comment down below your thought about this case in comment. If you had enjoyed this, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friend and family. Signing out. Thank you.